What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Keith Thurman, 29 wins, 1 loss, and 1 no contest, taking on Mario Barrios, 26 wins and 1 loss. This is the long-awaited return to the ring for Keith Thurman, the former WBA welterweight champion, former WBC welterweight champion. This is his first fight since losing a close split decision to Manny Pacquiao in July of 2019. Thurman actually had 2 fights in 2019, the first versus Josecito Lopez and then versus Manny Pacquiao. But prior to that, it had been about 2 more years since he had been in the ring, and that was his 2017 fight against Danny Garcia. So there was a big gap between the Danny Garcia fight and the Josecito Lopez fight, and then a equally big gap between the Manny Pacquiao fight and this Mario Barrios fight. So many are skeptical in terms of how close to 100% of Keith Thurman's prime he still has within him. A mix of injuries, inactivity, just kind of getting a sense based on his demeanor in interviews that maybe his heart isn't in it in the way that it was when he was in his, early to mid 20s. So in a division where not only do you have 2 excellent champions in Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford, and then another very good champion in Yordenis Ugas, but you also have like the next crop of hot prospect / contenders coming up like Virgil Ortiz Jr. and Jaron Boots Ennis. So, the waters are very deep right now in welterweight, and for Keith Thurman to be taking to the ring right now, sounding like he's all in, it's just a lot, and we'll see how this plays out with Barrios. But man, Keith Thurman for a time there was basically the class of the welterweight division, along with, you could say, maybe Kell Brook. This is when Errol Spence was just emerging, and Terrence Crawford was like at 135, winning a belt there, and then unifying all 4 belts at 140 before going up to welterweight 147. So yeah, Keith Thurman was the real deal in what we will call the post Floyd Mayweather era. And of course, Manny Pacquiao was still around as well, as he was still around several years after that. But at the time, this is when Pacquiao was kind of caught up in after getting knocked out by Marquez in the 4th fight, building himself back against Brandon Rios, and having the 3rd fight with Timothy Bradley, the fight against Jeff Horn. So it was like Manny Pacquiao was still around big time, but he was in his mid-30s, so people didn't really expect that he was going to be fighting the next crop up, basically the Keith Thurmans, Sean Porter, Errol Spence, and so forth. It was more like he was going to fight the already established names, and this is around the time he had also fought Floyd Mayweather in that mega fight. So Keith Thurman, people will say, was ducking the emerging Errol Spence at the time. But, from Keith Thurman's standpoint, no, he was eyeing the bigger fish, those bigger fish being Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Manny Pacquiao. In the same way that, the currently established champions, Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford, Spence was about to fight Pacquiao last year before his eye was diagnosed with the detached retina. So it's always, you've got fighters who are looking for the bigger paydays, the bigger fish, whereas now it could look like Spence and Crawford have no real interest, perhaps, in fighting Jaron Boots Ennis and Virgil Ortiz, basically the next guys up. Yeah, when Keith Thurman was looking like the class of the division at welterweight, it would be Errol Spence that was the next up, the avoided fighter at the time. But, when we were first watching Keith Thurman coming up on some significant undercards, like he was featured on the Juan Manuel Marquez versus Katsitas fight. I believe that was against Fabio Medina. Keith Thurman was like a knockout artist at this time, just kept working up the ranks, knocking out an aging Carlos Quintana, who, if you guys remember, had beaten Paul Williams before Paul Williams knocked him out in the rematch, once upon a time. But the big crossroads fight for Keith Thurman was actually against Diego Chavez, who was a undefeated knockout artist himself. Both of them were young, undefeated knockout artists who were both just surging. They fought on the Andre Berto versus Jesus Soto Caras undercard. And in fact, this was a Golden Boy card in 2013 that was billed as Knockout Kings 2. That was the theme of the entire fight card. Again, Berto versus Caras, Soto Caras was the main event, and on the undercard was Keith Thurman versus Diego Chavez, where it was actually Diego Chavez who was the slight A side over Keith Thurman, believe it or not. This was Chavez versus Thurman. And this was an outstanding fight where Chavez basically won the first couple rounds. You know, it was looking like, you know, the unstoppable force against the immovable object, and them basically clashing as knockout kings. But this was the fight that really showcased Keith Thurman as like a sweet science guy. So it's like, not only can he really crack with both hands, but when, you know, Diego Chavez was just really putting it on Keith Thurman, he bloodied his nose. Paulie Malignaggi suggested that it could be a broken nose. And so you started seeing Keith Thurman say, wait a second. And then his, you know, cornerman, Dan Birmingham, you know, his longtime trainer, after Ben Getty, Thurman's former trainer, had passed away at the age of 63, battling diabetes. Thurman was always on record talking about how much of his career he owes to Ben Getty. Well, Dan Birmingham took over the reins after Getty's passing. So Birmingham's in the corner, you know, basically saying, you know, essentially box this guy. Don't get too caught up with just exchanging in the pocket, because, you know, it's one thing to have your nose bloodied in a fight, but if it's like a fight that you're winning but you just got caught and bloodied up, I mean, that happens pretty frequently. But when you're apparently losing the fight in a firefight when the bullets are flying and you get your nose broken, that's a pretty hectic situation. So in Chavez versus Thurman, we really had to see Thurman make adjustments mid-flight and basically have to battle from adversity to stop, again, an undefeated, a knockout artist, a very scary fighter. Like, Paulie was talking about how much he was just remarking on Diego Chavez's poker face throughout the fight, where his facial expression doesn't change, whether he's winning the round, losing the round. He just was a tough customer, Diego Chavez was. Well, Thurman started moving around the ring, not moving too much. He was still engaging and working behind the jab, throwing his power punches, but he started to outbox Diego Chavez when plan A wasn't working. So he started to win some of the rounds where you started seeing a very disputed scorecard with the three unofficial judges. I think it was Farhood, Bernstein, and Paulie Malignaggi, where you had one guy who had Chavez up by a round, another guy had Thurman up by a round, and I think Paulie had it at a draw, and this was like through like 6 or 7 rounds. So Keith Thurman started to turn things around, ended up dropping Chavez with a beautiful left hook to the body, because Keith Thurman will do like a feint. He'll do like a kind of half jab up top where he just puts his paw out there, and he'll go like that just to get you to react high, and then he came low with a beautiful left hook to the body, sends Chavez down to one knee. Chavez makes it out of the round and then gets stopped in the next round. So this was a very pivotal fight between Thurman and Chavez. Thurman scores the 10th round knockout of Chavez. And, you know, Chavez's career, you know, was never really the same after that. Yes, he did have a split draw versus Timothy Bradley. He lost in a barn burner against Brandon Rios in a fight where he was actually disqualified for, you know, repeated fouls against another tough customer, another blood and guts type of fighter, Brandon Rios. It was a great looking fight that, again, Diego Chavez ended up getting DQ'd. Rios wins via decision. Well, via DQ. And then Chavez fought the draw with Timothy Bradley, won his next 3 fights, and then he started becoming like a win some, lose some guy, where he lost like 2 in a row, won 1, lost his next 2. So, yeah, you know, this was a very big turning point for both Thurman and Chavez, because after beating Diego Chavez, that's where, you know, Keith Thurman's very next fight is against Soto Caras, who ended up beating Andre Berto in the main event, where Thurman versus Chavez was on the undercard of. Soto Caras stopped Andre Berto, so Thurman fights Soto Caras in his very next fight. This took place on the Adrian Broner versus Marcos Maidana undercard, and Keith Thurman stopped Jesus Soto Kara's TKO in the 9th round. So by this time, he's looking way more multi-dimensional than he was, in the early part of his career, where he was truly one-time Keith Thurman, where he was just knocking people clean out. Well, after that very big win against Soto Kara's, he knocks out Julio Diaz. He wins a decision versus Leonard Bundu, wins a decision against Robert the Ghost Guerrero, who was looking really good, for some time, had a big win over Andre Berto, and then lost, of course, to Floyd Money Mayweather. Well, Keith Thurman beats Guerrero. This was, I would say, a post-prime Robert Guerrero, who kind of became a shot fighter, or a very diminished fighter, pretty suddenly in his career. But yeah, after beating Robert Guerrero, that's when Keith Thurman fights Luis Collazo, where Thurman gets hurt visibly pretty badly to the body against Collazo, where he's trying to buy time. Not too dissimilar from when Manny Pacquiao hurt him to the body in, I believe, the 5th round of their fight. So Keith Thurman's trying to get out of harm's way, just trying to buy time. And then he ends up coming back to stop Luis Collazo in the 7th round. Not that he was losing the fight. He was up on the scorecards, but yeah, he got hurt pretty badly, and it made for a pretty dramatic fight against Collazo. And then it's after that he fights the classic against Sean Porter. Now, Sean Porter, I was mentioning who was the class of the division at the time, and I said that it was probably Kell Brook along with Keith Thurman, but that's because Kell Brook beat Sean Porter to win the IBF belt. That was the same IBF belt that Spence would win from Kell Brook. But yeah, Kell Brook won it off Sean Porter, who was just looking sensational for a moment in time after beating Devin Alexander, taking his belt, and then defending that belt against Paulie Malignaggi, where I would say that was the scariest Sean Porter has ever looked. He looked outstanding and devastating against Paulie Malignaggi. So that had me and a lot of others thinking like, damn, this is, Sean Porter's the future of the division, which he did go on to have a great career, but I was looking at him like, damn, is this like a 147-ish Mike Tyson-like fighter, because of the way that he just disposed of the very tough to stop Paulie Malignaggi? Well, it ended up being more the exception than the rule when it comes to Sean Porter's punching power, because the way that he dusted Paulie Malignaggi was not a foreshadowing of what was to come in terms of Sean Porter's punching power. Again, he won the vast majority of his fights, but he wasn't a grade A level knockout artist. So Sean Porter in 2016 enters the ring against Keith Thurman, who at this time had a WBA interim title through several of those fights against Bundu, against Julio Diaz, against Robert Guerrero, basically defending his WBA interim belt before the WBA finally made him a regular champion. And then by the time he fights Sean Porter, it's finally for the official Super WBA title, because they finally stripped Floyd Mayweather after he retired after beating Andre Berto, because Floyd Mayweather was the longtime WBA champion. So this Keith Thurman versus Sean Porter fight is the first time that Keith Thurman is actually defending the Super WBA belt. And again, this fight ended up being a back and forth classic against Sean Porter. For more context into this particular fight, listen to the Sean Porter's podcast. It's called The Porter Way. He actually interviews his former opponent and longtime, not best friend, but they have such a long relationship with each other, dating back to the amateurs, Keith Thurman and Sean Porter do. But Sean Porter interviews Keith Thurman on The Porter Way, and you hear Keith Thurman open up and just be honest and just have this fleshed out conversation about this fight in particular. They talked about other things, but this fight they really keyed in on because it was a classic between Thurman and Sean Porter. So for some extra context, give that a listen. Like Keith Thurman's talking about how he actually managed this fight against Porter round by round, like what the actual strategy was. Like win the first round, you could give up the second round, then come back in this round and this round. Very interesting stuff. Very cerebral fighter Keith Thurman is, to the point where Sean Porter is asking Keith Thurman, like, did you take this round by round methodology in all of your fights, or did you only use this as an approach against me? Like, Sean Porter was very curious and interested in Keith Thurman's round-by-round methodology as Thurman was breaking it down. But yeah, Keith Thurman versus Sean Porter was a sensational classic. By this time, Keith Thurman is looking like such a well-rounded fighter. He went from basically being a knockout artist to moving around, against Diego Chavez and others, Robert the Gross Guerrero as well. But by the time he fights Sean Porter, you know what his strategy is. Keith Thurman has to try to navigate that, and this results in a very disputed, unanimous decision win. But people who are watching that fight, you do have a contingency of people who thought that it should have been a draw. Some people thought Sean Porter should have won. Some people thought Keith Thurman should have won. It was one of those razor close 115 to 113 type fights that, a lot of the welterweight elite fights ended up being those it could go either way types of 113, very close 115 to 113 type of fight. Whether you're talking Keith Thurman versus Danny Garcia, which would be Keith Thurman's very next fight, or if you're talking, Spence versus Sean Porter, or Sean Porter versus Danny Garcia, you just had a lot of that. Sean Porter versus Ugas was one of those razor close fights. But yeah, Keith Thurman versus Sean Porter, highly entertaining, highly dramatic, and Keith Thurman ends up winning the decision. And it was basically Sean Porter trying to close the distance, Keith Thurman trying to fight from a range, and Keith Thurman was basically saying he thought he won the decision. This is, again, in that Sean Porter podcast, saying, I felt like I won because the judges were able to see my shots a little bit cleaner because I was scoring at range, whereas Sean Porter is smothering a lot of his own shots that they don't end up appearing as clear as some of Keith Thurman's punches looked. Very interesting style clash and just matchup between Thurman and Porter. Give that one a look, and even if you've seen it and watched it when it happened, it's worth a rewatch because of how good and exciting and interesting that fight is. By the way, Keith Thurman versus Diego Chavez, another fight that I would really urge you to rewatch. But Keith Thurman then takes that momentum. He's now he's the super WBA champion who's now defended that successfully against Sean Porter. Then he fights Danny Garcia, who was surging at the time, and Keith Thurman wins a split decision win over Danny Garcia. Now, I thought that Thurman's win over Garcia was a little bit more clear-cut than his win against Sean Porter, but this one ends up being the one that's a split decision, not a unanimous decision win for Thurman. So this is actually for the WBC belt as well as for Thurman's WBA belt, because Danny Garcia had won the WBC welterweight belt in a vacant title fight against Robert the Ghost Guerrero. So Danny Garcia is actually one of the champions coming into this unification fight. Keith Thurman wins this one. Again, very close, split decision win. So now Keith Thurman is the WBC and the WBA champion. And this is where he starts dealing with injuries to his shoulder, elbow, his hand. He starts getting these repeated nagging injuries that keep him out of the ring for almost 2 years. So again, Keith Thurman couldn't have been hotter, and it's just super unfortunate that at his absolute peak, where if he were to fight, a lot of people wanted to see what would happen if Keith Thurman fought Floyd Mayweather when Keith Thurman was in his prime and Floyd was on his way out. Keith Thurman was just looking great, and I would have loved to have seen, for instance, Keith Thurman, I'm talking prime Keith Thurman, we're talking 2017, 2018, against, Errol Spence, or later on, Terrence Crawford. But at least to this point, we haven't gotten any of those fights. We did get Keith Thurman versus Manny Pacquiao, but it was such a robbery, and I mean robbing Thurman of the most golden point of his career, even earning potential-wise, even though he obviously made a killing against Manny Pacquiao, made a lot of money. Maybe not as much as he would have made if he was still surging in the way that he was surging around this time. He had those back-to-back wins versus Sean Porter and then Danny Garcia. Because keep in mind, you're talking a unified champ with 2 of the 4 belts, the WBC and the WBA, the 2 biggest, most widely recognized belts. He's still undefeated, and now he's beaten some very, very good fighters and a lot of good fighters just below that elite level. So Keith Thurman in his absolute prime is battling injury and has to deal with almost 2 years of inactivity. He eventually returns to the ring against Josecito Lopez. And by this time, Errol Spence has emerged as the IBF champion. Keith Thurman is now only the WBA champ because the WBC stripped him. So ironically, now Sean Porter's the WBC champ, which he would then lose to Errol Spence Jr. But Sean Porter won that WBC belt, which they stripped from Keith Thurman, and Porter won that in a vacant title fight against, again, Danny Garcia. And by the way, the boxing channel Boxing Wave, he points out how Danny Garcia always happens to be like one fight away from another vacant or title fight. It's just weird the way that works. But yeah, Thurman eventually returns to the ring. Now he's only defending his WBA belt, and that's against Josecito Lopez, where back in the day, this would have been a unanimous decision win, if not a knockout or stoppage win for Keith Thurman. I truly believe that, but he actually gets rocked very badly against Josecito Lopez, where we have never seen Thurman hurt worse. Even when he got dropped against Manny Pacquiao, I don't think he was hurt as badly as he was in this round against Josecito Lopez, where you started seeing his head snap back from like jabs and right hands in a way that you just hadn't seen Keith Thurman look that just out of sorts and defenseless, almost out on his feet, where you saw in slow motion his eyes roll back and he barely is making it out of the round. I don't know how he didn't go down in this round. It was that bad. Well, he ends up winning a majority decision win. It should have been a unanimous, I thought, but majority decision win against Josecito Lopez, and then it's after that he fights Manny Pacquiao. And Manny Pacquiao ends up winning a split decision win over Thurman, capturing Thurman's WBA title. So that's how Thurman lost his remaining belt. And that was a great fight where Pacquiao dropped Thurman in the first round. Thurman battled back, got hurt again badly to the body, like in the third or I think the fifth round, where he basically took his mouthpiece out and tried to just run around the ring and buy some time. And yeah, it ended up being a very close fight. I think most people forget about how close Thurman ended up making that fight against, a 40-year-old Manny Pacquiao. Just remarkable. Like, Pacquiao was like 10 years older than Keith Thurman, damn near. And the fact that Manny Pacquiao fought that well was incredible. One of the best achievements, I thought, of Manny Pacquiao's illustrious career. But after that fight, Keith Thurman, a man of many interests, again, a very cerebral guy, basically is out of the ring for the next couple years, battling those just nagging hand injuries and so forth. And so Keith Thurman is now, he's not a super old fighter. He's still 33 years old. That's younger than Terrence Crawford. But when you couple that with the inactivity and then Thurman's, just people not being sure of whether Thurman is all in, even though right now he's saying all the most convincing things that would lead you to believe that he is all in. It's just hard to imagine that 33-year-old Thurman is as committed as he was as a young 20s, mid-20s, late 20s fighter. And, the first thing that I could see, having rewatched the fight against Chavez and Diego Chavez, and the fight against Sean Porter, and then the fight against Josecito Lopez, Manny Pacquiao, is Thurman doesn't move. He still moved pretty well, but if you look at his feet and how good his reflexes seem to be, where he was just getting off first, and his just pinpoint accuracy was magnificent a few years ago, and he still has a lot of it in these fights against Josecito Lopez and Manny Pacquiao. But I get the feeling that some of that footwork has reduced just a tad. And that's natural. Like, how can you expect somebody to move and have as active feet, especially like in the middle and late rounds? And keep in mind, it was Thurman who was surging late in that Pacquiao fight. But how can you expect somebody in their, when they're approaching their mid-30s to have as active of feet as they did when they were in their 20s? It's just a lot to ask. I don't think Thurman has that 100%. I do believe that he is convincing himself that he's as dug in as he was, and he's obviously not back into boxing for this Mario Barrios fight. This is obviously something that you would want to springboard, you being Thurman, into bigger fights against either, Errol Spence, Terrence Crawford, you name it. Basically the biggest paydays that could be had. I've even heard him float out a fight against Gervonta Davis, which it doesn't make a lot of sense when you consider their divisions, but who the hell knows? We've been seeing a lot of crazy things in terms of matchmaking with Gervonta Davis, so I can't call it. But now Keith Thurman is about to fight Gervonta Davis's two fights ago for Gervonta Davis, because he fought Isaac Cruz. But 2 fights ago, middle of 2021, Gervonta Davis fought Mario Barrios, who's, he's fought at lightweight. He has dabbled in welterweight, but his truest division looked like it was 140. That's where he's done his most significant work, Barrios. In fact, that's where Gervonta Davis ended up going up to fight Mario Barrios. So this is Mario Barrios's, I guess you could say, return to welterweight. And Barrios, he's a tall fighter. He's like 5'11" to Keith Thurman's, between 5'7" and 5'8", 5'7" and a half. Thurman's reach is 69 inches compared to Mario Barrios' 71-inch reach. And Mario Barrios, he's a good fighter. This is going to be orthodox versus orthodox. Barrios has a pretty good jab. He likes to kind of dip low and dig to the body. He gives up a little bit of his height. He doesn't fight as tall as he is, and it ended up costing him a bit against Gervonta Davis, even though Davis had to really dig deep to pull that fight out, to pull that stoppage win out against Mario Barrios, to the point where, Davis's mentor, promoter, Floyd Money Mayweather, had to go to Davis between rounds, and this is like halfway into the fight, basically warning Gervonta Davis, hey, you could be losing this fight. I just saw the unofficial scorecard. They have, the scorecard going this way. You might be losing. And so Davis is looking at Floyd like, what? And then Floyd's like, yeah, you want me to keep it real with you, or you want me to lie to you? So, yeah, Floyd Mayweather was obviously concerned about how things were going between Gervonta Davis and Mario Barrios. And Barrios, by the way, was inexplicably holding a WBA regular title at the time in a fight that he had won, that he had gained that regular WBA lesser title against Akhmedov. It was Batir Akhmedov. And that was after Barrios had good wins over Juan Velasco, and before that, Richard Zamora. That Richard Zamora win was on the Gervonta Davis versus Hugo Ruiz undercard. It was supposed to be Gervonta Davis against Abner Mares, but Abner Mares pulled out due to injury. But yeah, so Mario Barrios was on a good winning streak, but it didn't merit him being a belt holder in a division that has Josh Taylor and Regis Prograis and others who would be more deserving and have a greater claim to the throne than Mario Barrios. So yeah, but I don't want to get into the sanctioning politics. But yeah, so Gervonta Davis had a very difficult but impressive stoppage win over the pretty good Mario Barrios. And so now that Mario Barrios is going from that to then take on a inactive Keith Thurman, it makes for an interesting matchup, but I don't think that it's going to go very well for Mario Barrios, in the sense that I don't think that Mario Barrios is going to win the fight. So what do I expect to happen? I think Keith Thurman is still the better sweet science guy between the two. He's just an elite fighter. He is an elite fighter. It's just that he's now an inactive, slightly older fighter, but I think that he still has enough tools to win most of the rounds against Mario Barrios. The question is, does formerly one-time Keith Thurman still have the ability to hurt somebody and then to keep his foot on the gas and to get stoppage wins against good fighters? I think that it's more important that Keith Thurman gets some rounds under his belt. Not that he's got the option to necessarily just dust Mario Barrios in a couple rounds. I mean, if that was an option, maybe he should do that, so then they could springboard him into a fight that he really wants versus a decision win. So I think that a knockout would actually do Keith Thurman better and more justice than a unanimous decision win. It's just more scintillating to the boxing public. So there would be more of a demand for Keith Thurman to fight a top tier fighter. I just think that it's more likely that Keith Thurman, when the fight starts to slow down into a measured pace, that Keith Thurman's going to have moments of fatigue, moments where his legs aren't feeling 100% and getting kind of tired. So Mario Barrios is going to, I believe, give a very spirited effort. He's going to be able to show his durability, be able to take a licking and keep on ticking and keep on pressuring Keith Thurman, who's going to, at some point maybe be on a similar treadmill from hell that he was on against Josecito Lopez, where he was winning majority of the rounds, but it looked like he was really having to work and he wasn't throwing his hardest shots because he wanted to preserve some of his gas tank for the later rounds. I think that it's more likely that we get that type of a performance from Keith Thurman. And I think that he will win via unanimous decision, but even in a unanimous decision loss for Mario Barrios, I think that it would still do him well because you could build the narrative, hey, I went the distance and fought a spirited fight, 12 rounds against, the former unified champion Keith Thurman. So I think that this could be a win-win scenario where, no, you didn't beat Keith Thurman, but you gave a spirited effort. And for Keith Thurman, no, you didn't knock out Mario Barrios, but you did win the unanimous decision. So you are back in the swing of things and are ready for bigger and better fights to come for Keith Thurman. So yeah, I'm taking Keith one-time Thurman via unanimous decision over Mario Barrios. The question is, what happens after that? And that is going to be determined by, again, sanctioning politics and just the business of boxing. I saw that they, made this. They were going to have it a WBA or WBC eliminator, but then they decided to make it a non-final eliminator, so it doesn't guarantee a shot at the title if Keith Thurman is to win the fight. So, no, I don't necessarily think that Keith Thurman will necessarily be challenging for a title if he wins that, but it's not unlikely. The question is this: if Errol Spence ends up fighting Yordenis Ugas, where 3 of the 4 titles are on the line, whoever wins that fight, barring a rematch clause, like if Ugas beats Spence, but Spence has a rematch clause, yada yada, like let's say Errol Spence beats Ugas via close competitive decision, does Errol Spence then finally fight the guy that everybody wants him to fight, Terrence Crawford? Or does he pivot to a title defense against Keith Thurman or whoever wins that, tournament they've got going on with, Stanionis and Butayev, who just beat Jamal James? Who the hell knows? But we want to see at some point, if Errol Spence is to fight Ugas, and if Errol Spence beats Ugas, because again, if Ugas wins, who the hell knows where they go from there. But if Spence handles business against the very good Yordenis Ugas, I think that's a scary fight, very difficult fight. Does Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford finally happen, or does Keith Thurman get a favorable nod and a shot at somebody's title? Let me know what you think in the comments, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.